Thank you so very much. That's wonderful. I begin today with a little history quiz. Get your thinking caps on. Plymouth, Massachusetts, and just yell out the answer when you know it. Plymouth, Massachusetts, home of our oldest Unitarian Universalist congregation, was settled by Europeans in... Very good. And Jamestown in... And Santa Fe in 1610. Pensacola, Florida, 1596. St. Augustine, 1565. Ponce drove by it, or sailed by it. Why are so many of us, myself including before I did lots of reading this week, so deficient in our American history? We were taught about how the English tamed this wild continent. The Indians were Christianized or killed. The swarthy French were pushed north, and the Spanish pushed south. Those southern Europeans commingled with the natives more openly than the English, and the Spanish already had that Moorish influence. History, as I was taught, was about how pale whites settled the USA. Now today in school they attempt multiculturalism. Black history gets a month, the shortest month. And Spanish culture gets a day, Cinco de Mayo. Some conservatives bristle and fear that this is revisionist history. But I say that the history I was taught needs revision. It needs to be aligned with the truth. The USA is not the triumph of northern white men over lesser races and nations. That is the lie that I was taught. The Spanish, French, Native people, and Africans are not just spice in our white rice. From the beginning of our history, this nation has been multicultural. The recent immigration of Hispanics is not an invasion. This is a continuation of an uneasy relationship that has existed ever since Europeans invaded this hemisphere. We have been fighting the natives and fighting each other for a long time. Those who complain that the Spanish people are coming to America must remember that they got here before the English. Now, Columbus, who was an Italian sailing for Spain, came to the Caribbean in 1492. John Cabot, or Giovanni Cabot, was an Italian sailing for England, and he explored from Maine to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in 1497. In 1519, Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon set foot in Florida. In 1528, Narvaez went along the Gulf Coast. In 1540, Hernando de Soto went inland, and he went as far as Hickory, or as near as Hickory, to us in 1540. And if you go to Highlands, North Carolina, where our mountain retreat is, right at the end of the shopping district, there's a little historical marker that talks about how Hernando de Soto passed through that town as well. Now, this is 45 years before Sir Walter Raleigh attempted a colony on Roanoke Island. In 1542, Cabrillo explored the California coast, 35 years before Englishman Sir Walter Drake did. In 1540, Coronado was in Kansas, 264 years before Lewis and Clark. In 1565, Spain established St. Augustine. In 1581, they imported their first black slaves, meaning that Africans had settled in the United States before the English. 7 years before the attempt at Roanoke, 27 before Jamestown. How come they never told me that the Hispanics and blacks got here first? And of course, we all know that the Native Americans were here long before them. The mission at San Antonio, Texas, was established in 1718, San Diego in 1769. San Francisco was established in 1776, the year that the English colonists declared their independence. The Spanish helped us in the Revolution. They allied themselves with France against Great Britain, which was their common enemy. In 1779, the Spanish captured Baton Rouge and other forts near the mouth of the Mississippi, and they continued up the Mississippi, went across Illinois, and captured the fort at St. Joseph, Michigan. Now, in the beginning of the 19th century, the alliance between Spain and France didn't last long, and France started taking over Spain, and Napoleon eventually conquered it, and they began to lose control of their colonies in the New World. France took control of Louisiana in 1800 and sold it to the U.S. in 1803. In 1819, Spain sold Florida to the U.S. In 1821, Mexico broke free from Spain. Now, Mexico at that time included California and Texas and all the land in between. In Texas, Navarro, a wealthy landowner, invited Stephen Austin to settle the territory on the condition that the Americans who came in converted to Catholicism. This partnership brought prosperity to both men. Texas was intentionally multicultural, driven by profit more than nationality. Now, down in Mexico City, the central government wanted to control the economic power of Texas, and the Texans rebelled. Both Spanish and English speakers captured San Antonio from government troops in December of 1835. By February, General Santa Anna regrouped and recaptured the Alamo. His army of 5,000 defeated the 180 soldiers at the mission. They did not fight to the death, as in the movie of John Wayne, but they were captured and executed, and including the mostly Hispanic civilians who had taken refuge in the mission. In April, Sam Houston attacked Santa Anna's army while they were sleeping at San Jacinto, shouting, "Remember the Alamo." Now, Texas remained a semi-independent country from 1836 until it became a state in 1845. And this led to a war with Mexico. And it was this war that encouraged Thoreau to engage in civil disobedience, to go to jail for refusing to pay his taxes, for a war of aggression of the United States that was going to expand slave territory. And in this war, John Fremont went west from Colorado and captured San Francisco. Stephen Kearny went from Kansas and captured Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and San Diego. Future President Zachary Taylor captured Corpus Christi, and the great Winfield Scott took Veracruz. His army included junior officers Stonewall Jackson, George McClellan, Ulysses Grant, and Robert E. Lee. They were all fighting on the same side at that time until they planted the U.S. flag in Mexico City. Later, while those captains became general and started fighting their own civil war up here in the northern part, France took the opportunity to invade Mexico. And they, following the pattern of Winfield Scott, they landed at Veracruz and started marching towards Mexico City. And they were stopped at a city named Puebla on May 5th, 1862. This is the holiday that the Cinco de Mayo celebrates. It is not an Independence Day for Mexico. It's more like our stand at Lexington and Concord, or maybe even the War of 1812. But 2 years later, France did succeed in conquering Mexico and installed Maximilian as the emperor. But after the Civil War, the U.S. pressured France to leave Mexico, and they did. Now, for the rest of the 19th century, we quit fighting the Spanish and focused more on killing Native Americans until the Spanish-American War in 1898. And this finally destroyed Spain as a colonial power. We captured Cuba, Puerto Rico, as well as Spanish possessions in the Pacific, Guam and the Philippines. We sort of gave Cuba its independence in 1902 while retaining our rights to Guantanamo Bay. In the 20th century, we have not had official wars with Spanish-speaking nations, just police actions. Here are just a few. 1903, Panama. 1905, the Dominican Republic. 1906, El Salvador and Honduras. 1912, Nicaragua. 1916, the Dominican Republic again. In 1917, we made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens just in time for them to be drafted into World War I. In 1927 through 33, we went into Nicaragua to quell an uprising by General Sandino, after whom the Sandistas are named. In 1961, there was Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. In 1980, in Nicaragua and El Salvador, we had covert operations that were fighting the people who called themselves Sandinistas after General Sandino. And in 1980 to the present, we have operatives destroying cocaine fields in Colombia and Bolivia and involved in the civil wars there. And in 1983, when we went into Grenada, and in 1989, we went into Panama. These various conflicts have led to many refugees coming to our shores. Sometimes they're welcomed as workers, but always resisted as citizens. One of the major complaints is that Hispanics continue to speak Spanish. We forget that our German forebears spoke German up until World War I, that where I grew up in northern Michigan, everybody's Polish grandmother could not speak English. Jews have spoken Yiddish. Almost all immigrants to this nation are bilingual for at least the first two generations. The United States is alone in the world in thinking that learning a second language is a bad thing. And Spanish immigrants, especially Mexicans, are more likely to still have close family ties, and to ask them to give up Spanish is to ask them to give up their families. And they have enough economic incentive to learn English because it will raise their income. Our histories are intertwined. What is good for Hispanic workers is good for all workers. A strong economy in Mexico makes them better trading partners. We must recognize the logic of our fears. It is not possible for simultaneously all our jobs to go to Mexico and then all those Mexicans to come here and get our jobs. We need to overcome our fears And some of this is tied up with race. Mexicans and Central Americans are often commingled with Native Americans, and Caribbean Hispanics often have an African heritage. And unless they're Sammy Soso, they're not always welcome in this country. The face of England is not the face of the USA, and it never has been. We can no longer deny our Spanish heritage, nor can we prevent Spanish in our future. My generation learned Spanish by assimilation, or the food that we have learned to love: taco, tortilla, burrito, salsa. Our children in schools have more interactional conversation. Mañana, hasta la vista, que pasa. They'll talk these words just as if it's just a part of their own language as they learn. The next generation may learn a language that's unlike British English. American English will contain even more Spanish words than it does now. And Mexican Spanish will contain more English words than European Spanish. In 30 years, our people may not even be able to recognize the word origins in our English American language any more than we can identify now whether a word that we use has a Germanic or a Greek root. Our language will be truly American. This history lesson is also a spiritual question, because one of the deepest questions we can ask of ourselves is, who am I and who are my people? We can see that identification is fluid. When Stephen Austin decided to be a Texan, he decided also to be a Catholic and encouraged those settlers to change who they were and how they looked at the world. When we call ourselves an American, does it mean only Americans who look exactly like me? Or is our idea of being an American more expansive?